when two American medics saved everyone. The untold story of D-Day's most human battle, June 6, 1944. The largest amphibious invasion in human history had begun. Thousands of Allied ships crossed the English Channel. More than 150,000 soldiers stormed the beaches and skies of Normandy. For many, D-Day was remembered as a story of tanks, machine guns, and impossible courage. But hidden among the chaos was another story. One that wasn't about defeating an enemy. It was about saving human lives. A story where compassion proved stronger than hatred, and where two young American medics made a decision that would inspire the world for generations. This is the remarkable story of Kenneth and Robert Wright. A different mission. Before sunrise, American paratroopers from the 101st Airborne Division drifted through the dark skies above Normandy. Heavy anti-aircraft fire scattered transport aircraft in every direction. Many soldiers landed miles away from their assigned drop zones. Some landed in flooded fields. Others found themselves surrounded by German troops before they had even gathered their equipment. Among those parachuting into occupied France were two combat medics. Unlike riflemen or machine gunners, their mission was different. They were not sent to take lives. They were trained to preserve them. Their weapons were not rifles. They carried bandages, morphine, tourniquets, and medical supplies. Every wounded soldier represented another life that might still be saved. Lost in the darkness. As dawn slowly approached, the battlefield was filled with confusion. Gunfire echoed across the countryside. Explosions lit the horizon. Paratroopers searched desperately for their units, while German defenders rushed toward the landing zones. Separated from much of the division, Kenneth moved carefully through fields and narrow country roads. Every shadow could hide danger. Every building might contain enemy soldiers. Finally, he reached the small French village of Angoville-au-Plain. The village sat directly in the path of advancing American forces. Within hours, it would become one of Normandy's fiercest battlegrounds. Standing above the quiet stone houses was a centuries-old church. Its thick stone walls had survived wars before. Soon, they would witness another. An unexpected meeting. Inside the church, Kenneth discovered another American medic. His name was Robert Wright. Neither man had expected to meet there. Yet, history had brought them together. Without lengthy introductions, both immediately understood the situation. The invasion had only just begun. Casualties would soon arrive. The church offered the strongest shelter in the village. It possessed enough space to protect dozens of wounded men. Without hesitation, the two medics transformed the old church into an emergency aid station. There were no operating rooms, no hospital beds, very little equipment, only determination. Every wooden pew, every corner of the church, every available space would soon become part of their battlefield hospital. The first casualties. The silence lasted only minutes. Outside, rifle fire intensified. American troops fought street by street against determined German defenders. Soon, the church doors burst open. The first wounded soldiers were carried inside. Some could still walk. Others had to be dragged across the stone floor. Blood quickly covered uniforms. Medical bags emptied faster than expected. Bandages disappeared. Morphine supplies began running low. The medics realized something frightening. The battle had only begun. Yet their medical supplies were already becoming dangerously limited. Still, they refused to stop. Every patient received attention. Every injury was treated with whatever resources remained. A church surrounded by war. Outside, the situation became even more dangerous. Control of the village changed repeatedly as American and German troops fought for every building. Machine gun fire echoed through the narrow streets. Mortars exploded nearby. Smoke covered much of the village. From inside the church, Kenneth Moore could hear wounded soldiers crying for help beyond the walls. He knew waiting safely inside meant someone outside might die. So he made a decision, one that few people would have dared to make. Ignoring the danger around him, Kenneth prepared to leave the safety of the church and enter the battlefield once again. His mission wasn't to fight. His mission was to bring the wounded home, even if it meant risking his own life. In the next chapter, Kenneth repeatedly enters active combat to rescue wounded soldiers as both American and German forces battle for control of the village. A decision made inside the church will soon transform it into one of the most extraordinary places in all of World War II, when 2 American medics saved everyone. A sanctuary in the middle of hell, Kenneth Moore stepped outside into a village that had become a battlefield. Every street echoed with rifle fire. Bullets cracked through the air from every direction. American paratroopers fought desperately to secure each house, while German defenders launched fierce counterattacks. The church behind him had become the only place where wounded men still had a chance to survive. But reaching them meant crossing open ground with almost no protection. Kenneth searched the area and spotted an old wooden handcart resting beside a damaged farmhouse. Without hesitation, he dragged it into the street. It wasn't military equipment. It wasn't designed for war. Yet over the next several hours, that simple cart would carry countless lives away from death. As he pushed it toward the fighting, American soldiers shouted warnings. Machine guns swept across the road. Sniper fire echoed from hidden positions. Still, Kenneth kept moving. He wasn't carrying ammunition. He wasn't charging an enemy position. He was searching for men who still had a chance to live. Soon, he reached his first casualty. A young paratrooper lay wounded beside a stone wall, unable to move. With help from nearby soldiers, Kenneth lifted the man into the cart and hurried back toward the church. Inside, Robert Wright immediately began treating the wounded soldier. No sooner had one patient arrived than another appeared. Then another. Then another. Within a short time, every bench inside the church was occupied. The floor became an emergency hospital. Medical supplies disappeared rapidly. Bandages were washed and reused whenever possible. Water became precious. Every decision could determine whether someone lived or died. Outside, the battle grew even more violent. Control of the village changed repeatedly throughout the day. Some streets belonged to American forces 1 hour, only to be retaken by German troops the next. The church stood directly between both sides. It could easily have become another military objective. Instead, something extraordinary began to happen. Both armies recognized the Red Cross displayed on the church. For many soldiers, it represented something greater than victory. It represented humanity itself. Kenneth continued making rescue after rescue. Each trip meant exposing himself to enemy fire. Each return brought another wounded man through the church doors. Then, during one rescue mission, everything changed. Kenneth found a wounded soldier lying alone near a damaged building. His uniform wasn't American. It belonged to the German army. For a brief moment, The battlefield seemed to disappear. The only thing Kenneth saw was another human being bleeding to death. Without hesitation, he lifted the wounded German onto the cart and returned to the church. When he entered, silence filled the room. Several American soldiers stared in disbelief. Only moments earlier, they had been fighting German troops in the streets. Now, one of those same enemy soldiers was lying among them inside the church. No one spoke. Robert Wright looked at Kenneth. Neither man needed to say a word. Their duty as medics had never changed. Inside that church, uniforms meant nothing. The wounded German received the same treatment as every American before him. His wounds were cleaned. His bleeding was stopped. His pain was eased. As the hours passed, more wounded Germans arrived. Soon, American and German soldiers lay only a few feet apart. Outside, they had tried to kill each other. Inside the church, they shared the same blankets, the same medical supplies, and the same hope of surviving another day. The little stone church had become something almost impossible during wartime, a place where enemies became patients. As darkness settled over Normandy, the sounds of battle continued outside. But inside the church, another kind of battle was taking place. A battle against pain, against blood loss, against exhaustion, and against death itself. Neither Kenneth Moore nor Robert Wright knew how long they could continue. They had almost no supplies left. No doctor, no reinforcements, only determination. Yet neither medic considered leaving, because they understood something that everyone else had forgotten. In war, every life saved is a victory. The Germans retake the village. An extraordinary agreement forms between enemies. The church adopts a strict no-weapons policy, and one miracle inside the church changes history forever. Humanity's greatest victory night fell over the village of Angoville-au-Plain. The fighting had not stopped. Gunfire still echoed through the narrow streets. Artillery flashes lit the sky every few seconds, turning darkness into brief moments of daylight. Inside the church, however, another battle continued. Kenneth Moore and Robert Wright had now spent countless hours treating the wounded. Fatigue weighed heavily on both men. Their uniforms were stained with mud and blood. Their hands trembled from exhaustion. Yet every time the church doors opened, they found the strength to help one more patient. By midnight, nearly every corner of the church was occupied. The wooden pews were no longer places of worship. They had become hospital beds. Those suffering the most severe wounds were placed closest to the altar, where the medics could reach them quickly. Outside, control of the village shifted once again. German forces launched another determined counterattack. American units were forced to withdraw from several positions. Soon, word reached the church that the front line was collapsing. An American officer entered the church with urgent news. The remaining paratroopers would soon pull back to safer positions. He urged Kenneth and Robert to leave immediately. Staying behind could mean capture. The officer understood the danger, but the medics looked around the church. Dozens of wounded soldiers, American and German alike, were unable to move. Leaving meant abandoning them. Without hesitation, both men made the same decision. They would stay. Whatever happened next, their patients would not face it alone. By sunrise, German troops once again occupied much of the village. Soon, the church doors opened. German soldiers cautiously entered. Weapons remained outside as they carried wounded comrades inside. To everyone's surprise, there was no shouting, no violence, only silent cooperation. a German officer approached the two American medics. Instead of treating them as prisoners, he thanked them for caring for the wounded. The officer looked around the overcrowded church and immediately recognized the desperate situation. The medics had almost nothing left. Bandages were running out. Medicine was nearly gone. Water was scarce. The officer simply asked, "What do you need?" Kenneth and Robert answered honestly, "Medical supplies and a doctor." The German officer nodded. He promised to send both. It was an extraordinary moment. Only hours earlier, these men had been enemies. Now they worked toward the same goal: saving lives. Throughout the following day, the battle returned once more. American forces fought their way back toward the village. Gunfire erupted around the church again. But something remarkable happened. Whenever Kenneth or Robert stepped outside, wearing the Red Cross on their helmets and armbands, soldiers on both sides recognized them. For brief moments, the shooting slowed. Not because of an official ceasefire, not because anyone had ordered it, but because many soldiers understood that the medics carried no weapons. They carried hope. Again and again, Kenneth crossed dangerous streets to retrieve wounded men. Again and again, Robert prepared the church for the next patient. Their courage inspired everyone around them. Then, during one of the heaviest bombardments, disaster nearly struck. A mortar shell crashed through the church roof. It struck the stone floor and rolled across the aisle. Everyone froze. One explosion would have destroyed the crowded sanctuary. Seconds passed. Nothing happened. The shell had failed to detonate. It was an unbelievable stroke of luck. Robert immediately rushed forward, picked up the unexploded shell, and carried it back outside before anyone could react. Moments later, heavy machine gun fire shattered several church windows. Glass rained across the room. Miraculously, none of the patients suffered serious injuries. The church had survived once again. As the fighting gradually moved away from the village, silence slowly returned. For nearly 3 days and 2 nights, Kenneth Moore and Robert Wright had worked almost without rest. By the end of the battle, they had treated more than 80 wounded men. Most of them survived. Many later admitted they would not be alive if the two medics had chosen to leave. The war continued across Europe, but the story of the small church in Normandy became something much greater than a military victory. It became proof that even during humanity's darkest moments, compassion can still survive. Today, visitors who enter the church at Angoville-au-Plain can still see reminders of those incredible days. Some of the wooden pews still bear the stains left behind during the battle. A damaged floor tile marks the place where the unexploded mortar came to rest. Stained glass windows honor the courage of those who turned a battlefield into a place of healing. For Kenneth Moore and Robert Wright, medals and recognition were never the goal. Their greatest achievement wasn't defeating an enemy. It was refusing to let war destroy their humanity. Because on one of the bloodiest days in modern history, 2 American medics reminded the world that courage is not only measured by the lives you take, sometimes it is measured by the lives you choose to save. The end.